we can get started. Welcome everyone to the third keynote session of AFT'21. We are very, very excited to have Peter van Valkenburgh from Coin Center. Peter is the research director at Coin Center. And as most of you already know, Coin Center is working on so many interesting topics in the relation of blockchain and law and policy. And we're always looking forward to hear on what they're up to. So the floor is yours, Peter. And if you have any questions for Peter during his talk, feel free to send them on the chat window or the Q&A window. And we're going to make sure that there is some time at the end to answer our questions.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. We were chatting before. I'm sad that we're not in person because lots of you I've met before and find fascinating, and we can't mingle in a hallway somewhere, but thank you for having me. So my talk today is a modified version of a talk I actually also gave at another George Mason event. Coin Center worked with them to put on an event about Hayek, F.A. Hayek, the legal theorist and economist, and cryptocurrency. And I thought with some modifications to this presentation, it might actually be really interesting as a taste of the way we at Coin Center and myself think about legal theory with respect to cryptocurrency and how we can get better cryptocurrency policy, better crypto policy, as in cryptography instead of cryptocurrency, because all of these things intersect, especially when we start talking about regulating scientific research or limiting publishing of things like source code and things like that. So the title is The Fatal Conceit. The fatal conceit is a term that F.A. Hayek came up with in order to describe sort of the hubris of central planning in the way we build law. The notion that we're always limited as individuals in the amount of information we have about the world. And most information that's actually valuable in the world is things like price information, just what one person is willing to pay for something that is being offered by another person and what one person would be willing to sell something for. That information is hyper local. It's person to person, kind of like a lot of P2P stuff on the internet. And that information is often sort of disdained or thought less of as compared to the sort of centralized information that's really exciting, that like a brilliant policymaker in Congress or in the US Treasury has these great ideas for the future. It's that more book type learning and that more centralized information that often is preferred in policy making circles. Like we need to have smart ideas about how to regulate things rather than the sort of emergent bottom up knowledge. I'm sure there's similar ideas in the information sciences discipline and in maybe cryptography even, but you'll hear these things from me from an economics and law standpoint. So what we're going to do first is look at crypto, and I'm sorry, I have crypto all over this presentation and I'm talking to cryptographers. I do mean cryptocurrency when I say crypto in this talk. So crypto policy as a laboratory for Hayek's claims in a specific, very large book, a 3-volume book that he wrote called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, from which the fatal conceit concept emerges. There's a later book called The Fatal Conceit, but you should really, if you're interested in this stuff, just read the giant monolith that is Law, Legislation, and Liberty. So what is Hayek's central claim in Law, Legislation, and Liberty? So building on that description of local knowledge versus centralized top-down knowledge that we talked about a second ago, Hayek's claim in Law, Legislation, and Liberty is that we can maximize liberty, which he defined as the condition of existence for man, where we can use our knowledge to pursue our purposes. So we want the maximum freedom to use our knowledge that's unique to us to pursue whatever our purposes are that are unique to us. We're obviously going to need to have some form of law or regulation so that when we bump into each other while pursuing our own purposes, we can sort things out peacefully and without violence and in a way that's mutually beneficial to society. But what we really want is for everyone to be empowered to do whatever it is they want to do with fairly few judgments as to what those things might be. This is like our notion of liberty. And Hayek said in Law, Legislation, and Liberty that the best way to get there, in his opinion, but he's a smart guy, I think, is to use judge-made law rather than legislative law. And he made this distinction between what he called law. Sometimes he referred to it in the Greek word nomos, which is this sort of purpose-neutral, court-made emergent rules for just conduct. So just stuff that like bubbles up from people in cases and controversies, versus legislation, which he sometimes called thesis for the Greek again, which is purpose-specific rules and actions that must be carried out or administered. Like the tax code is a long list of things that you must pay taxes on. It's not an emergent sort of norms-based jurisprudence where we're just like, well, this person tripped over this sidewalk because the sidewalk curb was too high, so we're going to put liability here versus here. These are different kinds of things, you know. And another way to think about this distinction is a distinction between evolution of norms and laws in society versus what Hayek called constructivism, which is we're going to design the perfect way of ordering society rather than let it evolve or bubble up from below. And so, oh, by the way, on that slide, you know, the reason why I have the greater than symbol on the left, that's the court of Chancery, where a lot of the English common law evolved. And so this is like if someone sues you for breaking a contract, they could reference a case from like the 1400s where like two people in a contract disappointed each other's expectations. And the court of Chancery started to sort out what society should view as norms for obeying contract law. So that's like Hayek's evolutionary law. Is it's being made through this process, definitely a biased process back then because all the judges were white men, but still a process that was at least focused on individuals who've come together because they have a dispute, versus the other side, which is of course also a picture of all white men. But in this case, this is the parliament where they sort of set the rules for everyone, irrespective necessarily to the particular desires of individuals in controversy. So this is my graphic for representing this distinction between law and legislation, and Hayek's claim that we would prefer court-made law and general standards that emerge from cases and controversy to a bunch of like policy scientists on high telling us what to do. And so another way to think about what Hayek wrote is that the ideal way of ordering society would be for us to sort of find these mutual understandings about how we want to exist with each other and uncover them through conflict, through cases. Like you might get sued by the SEC for securities fraud or something like that. That's a case that might come up in the cryptocurrency world. A way that I've always thought, so ignore the text on the screen right now, Schopenhauer, who is quoted by Michael Oakeshott, who is a big fan of Hayek, also another great scholar, came up with this thing called the Hedgehogs Dilemma. And the Hedgehogs Dilemma is this notion that we've got this community of hedgehogs, and it gets cold at night. So at night, they need to huddle together for warmth or they'll die. But hedgehogs are spiky. So when they huddle together too close, they spike each other and it becomes worse than being cold. So they're in this constant state as a little community of hedgehogs of bumping into each other when they get too cold, but they get too close, and then going apart because their spines are too pokey. And society, in Schopenhauer's notion and in this idea of the hedgehog's dilemma, should be about finding that optimum distance between hedgehogs where they don't poke each other, but they still can share each other's warmth. And it shouldn't be something that a scientist looks and says the optimum distance between hedgehogs is 5 centimeters because the spines are, it should be something that the hedgehogs kind of discover themselves through this process of bumping into each other. I always thought it was a beautiful little fun story, and it works for kids because kids like animals. So Hayek's ideas are controversial. This is by no means what a lot of people in legal academia think is the right way to do policy. Again, a lot of people think that we should just, take a scientific perspective and try and, like through rational thought, come up with the best rules for governing things like, say, cryptocurrency transactions or just the way people interact in general. And there's some really notable critics like Weber, for example. So this is Weber, who said that it will be inevitable that as a result of technological and economic developments, the legal ignorance of the layman will increase, and law will need, by necessity, will need to be a rational technical apparatus, which is continually transformable in light of exponential considerations and devoid of all sacredness of content. And so, like, if you think about the ancient common law of contracts or of property or of torts, torts is a really weird one because it's not even a word we use. Torts just means like a touch. It'd be the hedgehogs bumping into each other and hurting each other. When you sue someone because a barrel fell out of a warehouse and dropped on your foot, and you say that shouldn't have happened, they had a duty to care for me, even as a stranger, you're suing them in tort. There's a lot of sacredness to all that content. It's kind of mystical and weird. And we might want to just say, you know, that's all garbage. That's all part of an old world where we believed in a lot of mythical things like law as a sort of science. And we had a lot of strange notions about duties and things like this. And it'd be better if we just wiped it all clean. And because of exponential considerations, because like things are happening fast now and technology is very advanced now, and no normal person can understand the hard issues that we're dealing with, we should just have specialists come up with new laws and wipe the slate clean and replace all that old crap from common law with like enlightened new policy. So Weber was writing as a critic of that sort of notion of the common law. And probably the most famous critic of the common law as a way of creating just rules for society would be Jeremy Bentham, who, of course, lots of people know as a sort of inventor of a sort of utilitarian notion of the good, the greatest good for the greatest number, et cetera, et cetera. Bentham hated the common law. He used to call the common law the law of your dog, basically. He said, when your dog misbehaves, you don't show the dog the rules and are like, this is the rule you broke, dog, and you knew about this before, and so we're going to have penalties. You don't. Your dog's just out there doing stuff that dogs do, and you hit them when they do things that you don't want them to do. You don't explain what you don't want them to do. You just hit them, and then your dog is constantly afraid of like, well, what if I do this, or what if I do this? So he said that's what the common law is like, because the common law has got all these weird like traditions and cases that don't make sense, and you don't find out that you violated the common law until you end up in court. And then it's like the dog's owner hitting the dog. It's great stuff. I actually disagree with Bentham. I think he's wrong. And I think he's silly. This is Bentham. This is actually Jeremy Bentham, this photo. He was so interested in a lot of weird stuff. He really believed that living humans should have a closer relationship with dead humans. So he wanted his body to be sort of preserved and mummified. And I think it's in Oxford College that he's still in a closet. But that's not his real head. That's a wax head, because freshmen kept stealing his head and using it to play soccer. So they had to remove that and put a wax head on. At least that's the story. I don't know. So I think he was kind of wrong about this closer relationship with dead people. But that doesn't mean he's wrong about law. I think he's also wrong about law, though. I just had to take that moment to make fun of Jeremy Bentham. Poor man who's like 300 years dead now. Anyway, so to test our theories about like this emergent bottom-up law being better for doing something really complicated, like solving cryptocurrency policy dilemmas, let's look at some cryptocurrency policy dilemmas. So the first dispute we're going to look at is this question. Is crypto token X, it could be any number of crypto tokens that I will not name, it could be Bitcoin, it could be a lot of them, is it a security for the purposes of US financial regulatory policy? And here's the thing, in the US, securities law regulation in the US is so damn old, because it started in the 30s in response to the Great Depression. It's so old compared to a lot of other regulatory law that was created in the 60s and 70s, that it actually is kind of like a common law system. It's kind of like the old laws of property and contract and tort, in that it's not super prescriptive. So the category of things that are regulated for investor disclosures, you're issuing a security, so you have to make disclosures, is this category of securities. And the definition of securities in the statute is really flexible and broad, so that courts can determine all the edge cases. Like when some weird new investment opportunity comes up, is it a security or not? We're going to actually have a flexible standard so that a court can determine whether this particular thing should have been regulated like a security or not. And so this is like, we determine the law through conflict. We determine the law as the hedgehogs bump into each other. And so the existing law in the US is this: a security exists when there is an investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits reliant on the efforts of a third party. So it's not like a security will be a thing called a security. It's not like a defined variable in computer science. It's this flexible variable that's going to be redefined based on a test, a 4-part test: investment of money, common enterprise, expectation of profits, reliance on the efforts of a third party. And so with any particular crypto token, we can run this 4-part test. It's always going to have to eventually go to a judge to run it with the authority of the judge, like when you compile your code down. But we could also run it before it gets compiled and just make our assumptions as to whether something's going to be a security or not. And we can see whether this flexible standard actually works for us, as I'm going to argue it does, better than an inflexible standard that would be more like some smart person's idea of what the standard should be. So with any token, we can ask, why is the token desirable? Is it desirable because people want to use it? Like people want to run smart contracts on Ethereum, so they need ETH? Or is it desirable because they want to invest in it because they expect it to go up in value? And that's going to go to our question of expectation of profits, one of those 4 prongs of that test. Is it useful? Maybe I don't really expect profits, or the profits would be secondary to my desire to use it, or is my primary desire just to get rich off of it? And then the other question that kind of informs that 4-part test is what backs up the value. So remember, the 4-part test included reliant on the efforts of a third party or promoter. That's where the expectations are either satisfied or unsatisfied, is on the efforts of a third party. And so we have to ask this question, okay, what does actually either disappoint those expectations or make good on those expectations? Is it a person? Is it like the issuer, the person who invented the technology or issued the investment asset? Or is it a broader group of people, like a network of people? So many people that we're no longer reliant on a third party who would be required to disclose facts about the investment, so that it's no longer a security. It's more like a different investment, kind of like gold. A lot of people determine the price of gold, so many that we would never call one of them the issuer of gold who needs to register gold as a security at the SEC. And the cool thing about having a 2-part classification exercise is we can graph it. I am a lawyer who has like hard sciences envy because I'm a soft social sciences person. So please forgive me as I misuse geometry. On this axis, which is this is the y-axis, I had to think. See, I had to check myself for a second. We have why is the thing valuable. On the bottom, we'll have things that are more sought for their use, and on the top, we'll have things that are more sought for investment purposes. And on the x-axis, we have what creates that value. On the left, we have the value comes from a whole bunch of people, like a network of people. And on the right, the value more comes from one person. It's more centralized, we might say, in the crypto space. Now, we could fill this with tokens. I could put like a bunch of projects logos up here and make people angry, but I'm not going to do that, because we're talking about background law that's been around since the 1930s and has come up case by case all over the place in things that aren't even, crypto. Crypto didn't exist as an asset that you'd invest in until very recently. So I can fill this with a bunch of case law. I can fill this with things that are obviously securities. So that's Tim Cook, CEO of Apple. Obviously, shares of Apple stock are a security. Why? Because you don't buy a share of Apple stock to use it as a computer. You buy a share of Apple stock exclusively as an investment. And who makes that investment valuable or not? At the end of the day, it's the people in charge of Apple. So it's Tim Cook, the board of directors. Those are the people that really have all the power. And so this is why we have a disclosure regime. We say Tim Cook, the issuer of Apple stock, needs to disclose facts about the company so just to not mislead investors who are investing in shares. Now, at the other end of this, we have something like gold, where we say, look, this is something between useful and investment. Some people use gold for scientific purposes, for dental purposes. Most people just use gold because it's either beautiful and they think it'll go up in value in the long run, or they want to commit to their wife that way, or, they just want to invest as a commodity investor. It's not sentimental at all. They just expect it to make them rich in the long term. So, that's not traditionally a security, mostly because the value, it may be something people seek for an investment, but the value doesn't come from an issuer. The value comes from thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are either digging gold up out of the ground, increasing the supply, who are trading it on markets as individuals who just want to buy it or sell it or speculate or things like that. The value doesn't come from one person who like invented gold and determines what gold is and how gold functions. And then, we could put other things on this graph. So other really useful commodities like oil and maybe real estate, although real estate people speculate a lot for, and oil, the price went negative because of speculation during COVID. I don't know if you guys remember that, like oil was trading negative, which is insane. But anyway, these things are as far from securities as you can get, really, because they're usually always being used. And yes, sometimes people speculate on them as well. And they're very much dependent for their value on a big network or a group of people. They're not dependent on their value from like some person who's like, I am the issuer of all oil. That makes no sense. Although, actually OPEC, but we're not going to talk about that now. So I'm getting off on lots of tangents, which I shouldn't, because that's how these talks end up being like 3 hours. I hope you're enjoying this talk. In the upper left-hand corner, there's an interesting line of cases that goes way back again, all the way to the 1940s and such, where your thing isn't regulated as a security. So we're not in the upper right, we're in the upper left, which is kind of not security land. If your thing is a member-run LLC or a member-owned cooperative, where everyone who owns a share of this thing has a role to play in its management. They're not limited partners, they're all general partners. They're all people who could take steps to make the thing better themselves. And none of them have any special knowledge compared to anyone else there. It's not like there's some head honcho at this thing who could lie to the lower shareholders and deceive them. It's actually like we're all equals. And so there's no reason for securities law in that context, because there's no person who actually should be forced to disclose things to the more vulnerable investors. And these things are traditionally not regulated as securities. And if you're really into the crypto world, this might sound familiar. This is the dream or the idealized portrait of something like a DAO, where everyone is involved in the management of this thing that we're all a token holder of. No one is a limited partner, we're all general partners. Maybe it's not a security for that reason. And then there's other things that there's case law about, like memberships to golf courses. You might say like, tokens aren't investments. They're like access tokens to use a service, like to run an Ethereum smart contract. And there's actually securities case law on similar access tokens pre-cryptocurrency. And some of the most interesting cases happen to do with golf courses. Shockingly, Trump is not a litigant in any of these golf courses cases, but there's other real estate developers who were, because there's sort of two branches of the case law here. In one branch of the case law, the person who's selling golf course memberships is somebody who runs the golf course, but the golf course is already built. It's like, here's a membership. Maybe it's even transferable, so you could give it to someone else, kind of like a share of stock or a cryptocurrency. But it's just going to give you the right to play on my course. It doesn't give you anything else. It's not a security then, because you're not buying it for an investment purpose. You're buying it to play on my course. But then there's another line of cases where the person selling the memberships is selling memberships to a golf course that hasn't been built yet. And they're selling the memberships before the golf course is built to raise money to build the golf course. And there's a chance, if you're buying this membership before the golf course is even built, the golf course will suck. And then you lose your money because you already spent the money on the membership. And so here we actually have the kind of information asymmetries that might make us want the builder of the golf course to do disclosures. And we have this sort of risk. And this is sometimes called the risk capital test. So if the golf course is already built and you're selling memberships, some of the case law says not a security. If it hasn't been built yet, and you're saying like, this is going to be an awesome golf course, it's going to be the best, it's going to be huge, then it is a security. And isn't that interesting in light of token pre-sales and ICOs, where the network is like a dream of someone 3 years off versus someone selling a token on a network that's already doing stuff for people? It's kind of exactly the same. There's case law about things like performances at a theater. We could put theater tickets here. Most people buy theater tickets because they want to go to the show, but actually people speculate about theater tickets and they resell them. And then here's another branch of interesting cases. That's a whiskey barrel with a receipt on top of it. I made that in Photoshop. There is a case in New Jersey, which kind of makes sense, where there was this guy who made whiskey. I think he even called it Scotch, which is wrong because it was made in New Jersey, so it can't be Scotch. But anyway, he had a warehouse full of whiskey barrels. And he said, like, look, this is going to be really good Scotch style whiskey. You should buy some of this. But look, it's only going to be good if it ages for 20 years. So you should buy some now when it's just starting to age. And in 20 years, you could take your giant 100-pound barrel of Scotch, or I'll find someone who wants Scotch at that point, bottle it and sell it to them, and I'll give you the money from the sale. And you might say, well, that's not a security. I'm buying whiskey. I just have a drinking problem. I'm not a speculator. But really, if you can't drink it for 20 years and you're expecting somebody to find another buyer for it and sell it at a profit, it's a security. It's just like buying a share of Apple stock, really. You're just investing in this guy's weird, not in Scotland, Scotch distillery. It's probably not even a good investment. There's other weird cases that are about like selling things like beaver pelts, but they're selling the beaver before they even kill the beaver and make it into. We're not going to go there. Securities law is crazy because there's so many cases, right? And so there's this big tapestry of common law cases that has to do with golf courses and whiskey and gold and oil and member-run cooperatives and traditional stocks like Apple. And now there are tokens that are kind of like all these things. People have issued tokens that are just like equity securities. And people have issued tokens that are supposed to be like member-run LLCs. We all share in this thing, the DAO, and we all get to control it and we all get to profit off of it. There are tokens that are much more like gold, where no one except maybe like thousands of people taken together affect the price. And you might look at Bitcoin as like digital gold. There are tokens that are primarily used as a fuel for running applications. Like this is one way of describing Ethereum. They even call it gas when it's used to power smart contracts. So it's kind of like oil. There are tokens that are pre-sold before the golf course is built, before the technology is ready. And there are tokens that are kind of like you're waiting 20 years for the damn thing to actually be good enough to be used. And you really just expect to sell it when it's that good enough, just like the Scotch in the barrels. So, the case law is rich and actually applies pretty well to all of the weird stuff that people have been doing with cryptocurrency over the last 5 years, even though most of these cases are they're older than me. So I would argue that that's actually pretty great. Here, I'm going to put a bunch of people's projects here. I probably shouldn't do that. But, maybe this is where a bunch of stuff actually lies on this when it comes to crypto. And then maybe this is the jurisdiction of the SEC, because this is the other thing about a flexible test is a court will ultimately determine, SEC, you've overreached. Your jurisdiction here is broader than it should be. And so maybe the court will say, this is more what your jurisdiction looks like, or this. And honestly, this is what we'd like the SEC's jurisdiction to look like. This is where I think you really have the information asymmetries that make disclosures in the form of securities disclosures really like sensible. And I put the DAO there. That was the old DAO, the one they wrote the report about. But if you moved it to the left and the DAO really was member run, there weren't sort of choke points within the way the DAO was structured, then maybe it falls out of security law because it truly is member run. Depends on the DAO. This is the DAO, the famous one that failed. Of course, that's like ancient history now, which is weird. And people were like, everyone's doing DAOs now. I'm like, really? That thing that failed? They're like, no, new ones, better ones. I'm like, sure, okay, fine. The SEC is going to love that. Anyway, let's contrast that, which is, in my opinion, a picture of emergent law, common law-like jurisprudence that can be applied to crypto. Let's contrast that with tax law. Tax law is the opposite of common law. It's this deep administrative code. It's this listing of thousands of things that are all taxed differently. And you need to know specifically, like, what did some tax bureaucrat say 30 years ago about the specific type of thing? It wasn't a bunch of cases where people were like, oh, how should we tax this versus this? Because I want to tax it this way and you want to tax it this way. It's just this long list of what somebody at the IRS once said about taxes or what somebody in Congress once said about taxes. And it's just this huge mess. And the information here isn't bottom-up information from a bunch of like cases and controversy, like the golf course owner and the investors in the golf course. It's a bunch of sort of administrative knowledge of people who are focused on tax law, really aspy people who are focused on tax law, if you know what I mean. And so another way to like take an example is to look at what just happened. So if you've been following Coin Center's work, I was just chatting with the hosts that I was on paternity leave for a lot of this, actually. But recently we had this big fight in the US over the infrastructure bill. And the infrastructure bill is this attempt to raise a bunch of money to build bridges and things in the US to stimulate the economy and to get us back from COVID. But people don't like raising taxes in the US. So when the infrastructure bill came around and said, well, how are we going to pay for all this bridge building? Clever people in Congress and maybe at the Treasury were like, oh, maybe we can do it without raising taxes by closing tax loopholes. So we'll come up with a way to have pay-fors for all that infrastructure. And one of the pay-fors could be getting people to pay their crypto taxes. Now, this is interesting because there probably are a lot of people that don't pay their taxes in crypto. But there are a lot of people that don't pay their taxes in cash businesses and other places as well. But how do we fix that? The top-down legal perspective would be, we just need to really specifically write how people who are dealing in cryptocurrencies get taxed. And one of the things that was proposed to close this tax loophole was this sort of like, let's, in an enlightened way, think about how we define brokers with respect to cryptocurrency transactions so that we can mandate that brokers report on the transactions of their customers, the people who are trading cryptocurrencies on their platform. Now, the funny thing is, the definition of broker in the tax law, which meant you had to report on your customers to the IRS, you had to say, my customer just made this much money in capital gains, was already pretty flexible and general. And so it actually already covered a lot of entities like, say, Coinbase, who does cryptocurrency transactions for customers. But in order to close this tax loophole to pay for the infrastructure bill, let's be really specific. And this language gets put in that says that a broker for cryptocurrency is any person who, for consideration, provides any service or application, even if non-custodial, to facilitate decentralized transfers of digital assets. That's a lot of words. Those are a lot of words that are, as you would say in computer science, undefined variables in the law. Like, this is a definition for broker, but in defining broker, we define it with a bunch of things that don't have a common meaning. Like, what is someone who's facilitating decentralized transfers of digital services or digital assets, rather? That could be a miner. That could be a layer 2 node. That could be an internet service provider because they facilitate my ability to send the transaction to the network. It could be thousands of people, none of whom are traditionally understood as brokers. So by coming up with this top-down knowledge view of what a broker should be and trying to put it in legislation, this hasn't passed yet, but it could. And it's been changed since because of the good work that folks at Coin Center have done to sort of lobby Congress to make it less specific in the wrong ways. But because of the top-down quality of this thinking, it leads to more confusion than the bottom-up, more confusion than we would get if we just had sort of an emergent rule. A flexible standard, like the old definition of broker, which was middleman. Of course, Coinbase is a middleman. Of course, they're going to be taxed. We get more specific, facilitate decentralized transfers of digital assets. We have no idea what we're talking about. We could be talking about things that we really don't want to regulate as brokers. And so there was this whole fight over this. And the White House even got involved, which was crazy. And at one point, the White House and one of the senators that was amending this stuff suggested, well, let's make sure that proof of work miners are not treated as brokers, but that's it. To which the response is, well, there's a lot of other like networks out there that do proof of stake stuff or do like other consensus mechanisms like Byzantine fault tolerant, just more traditional BFT stuff. And like, why proof of work is not a broker, but other things might be? Is this crazy? And like, it got crazier. Like, at one point, the senator was like, all right, now both proof of work and proof of stake are exempted. But specifically, by listing those in legislation, which is, again, this problem of like top-down knowledge versus just like a flexible broad standard that can be interpreted judiciously, this is going to be a bad standard. These things don't have strong definitions. They're kind of just like vague metaphors we use to describe things in this space. And so Jerry, who's the executive director of Coin Center, tweeted, hey, can you guys help me list all the other non-proof of work and non-proof of stake consensus mechanisms? Just to sort of illustrate that only exempting those two and thereby inferring that everything else would be a broker is insane. We can't get down to this level of granularity in the way we write tax law. And the responses are great. So I just wanted to share a bunch of them. I wonder if they were trying to limit activity on proof of authority chains. I can guarantee you nobody in Congress knows what a proof of authority chain is, and I don't blame them because I don't know what a proof of authority chain is. But like, and so Jake, who does a lot of work in the DeFi space, is like, I think you're giving them too much credit. And this goes to this problem of top-down law. People often will perceive a poorly drafted top-down law, which is just poorly drafted because of ignorance or a limited knowledge, for being actually malicious. Like, oh, they must be coming after this thing specifically, when maybe they don't even know what this thing is and why their language covers or doesn't cover this particular thing. Here's a good list: proof of burn, proof of storage, proof of capacity, proof of activity, elapsed time, Solana, proof of vote. I love this. This is a terrible graph. I love this terrible graph because it's like, it's got colors and pictures to represent decentralized consensus mechanisms, which is usually not going to work well. Kristen Smith of the Blockchain Association rightly asked, what about consensus mechanisms that haven't been developed yet? Because this is obviously ongoing science. You guys are having a whole conference dedicated to some of these questions. Are we not supposed to exclude those, just the ones that exist today? This is a problem. Top-down laws, they don't age well. Securities laws actually aged pretty well. The golf course cases can still be used as a metaphor for tokens, but these things will not age well. There's no metaphor here. There's just a bunch of technical jargon. I like direct acyclical graphs. I guess is it direct? It's directed, right? It's like a DAG. Anyway, I don't mean to insult Sir Penguin, but you know, like that's fun. This is someone from XRP, of course, who thinks that they're obviously trying to go after XRP. So of course that pops up. What is this one? It's too small for me to read. Oh, GitHub itself is technically a blockchain. It's like, oh yeah, GitHub's a broker now. That's cool. Neat. Not to nitpick, but these things aren't even consensus mechanisms. They're just civil prevention mechanisms. Not wrong. Not wrong. Proof of oof. This is my favorite because it speaks to the millennial meme culture. Large oof versus medium oof. Proof of widen. This is a staffer for one of the senators who was actually standing up to help us, Senator Toomey, and say, like, we shouldn't be doing this crazy stuff. So Landon said, proof of widen, another senator who is helping us. Proof of guns and stake. I think this is probably a Bitcoin person, if I had to guess. Here's Andrew Miller, one of my favorite people, with a respectable list of very weird things that I've never heard of, like Enclave and Sawtooth. Anyway, I thought that was a fun list. So this is the insanity that comes from having a technical standard that some administrator or bureaucrat comes up with, rather than a general standard that emerges case by case. It's a disaster. And so I hope you note that, like, tax law is not going to work if we do it this way. And, you know, Hayek said exactly the same thing. He said that the thinking about general principles of legislation, like who should be taxed and who is not, has now fallen, and he's regretting this, into the hands of public lawyers versus common law private lawyers. That is, specialists in organization, so think of the IRS, who have often so little sympathy with lawyers' law, like I represent a client who's got, you know, special interests and certain things needed. They're so far away from that client representation and dealing with people with actual knowledge that one hesitates to describe them as lawyers. Hayek did not like public lawyers, like tax specialists. And maybe he's right, because we end up with a lot of weird, frankly, garbage, like the language that was in the infrastructure bill. And so this is the central claim, is that if we do a lot of top-down stuff, like have the legislature and tax specialists come up with a clear code of who is taxed a certain way and who is not, it's going to be worse than if we have sort of an emergent, flexible standard that the courts sort out. And I want to note, this isn't just about the amount of documents, because I think that's often something that we confuse in the legal theory space. People like to point out that the tax code has gotten huge. It's like, oh, it's too much documents. Who could read all these documents? Well, the common law is also a huge number of documents. This is the law library at my law school at NYU, which I thought, it's not even the most comprehensive law library. Like, that's probably Yale or one of those fancy people at Harvard or whatever. But like, the NYU library is huge, full of books that are full of cases. And each one of those volumes has like hundreds of cases described in them. In fact, the NYU Law Library needed to expand, and so they built a giant subterranean law library under Sullivan Street in Lower Manhattan, probably at great cost. Granted, they charge a whole lot of money to go to school there. So, maybe it's justified. But so like these halls full of books, there's tons of information here. This isn't a problem in the sense that the tax code is too long, because there's an interesting thing. The tax code is a bunch of like nitpicky changes that were made one legislative session after another for some arbitrary or high-minded reason, kind of like the infrastructure bill tried to change crypto taxation to raise money to build bridges. The case law is a voluminous like list of stuff, a lot to read, but every one of those cases has unique circumstances from two parties who ran into each other with a specific problem. And a judge had to look at the unique information of each party and say, in this case, this should be the rule. And so it is rich with sort of human level knowledge rather than abstract technical knowledge, and helps us kind of find ourselves as a society and decide how we might want to regulate something, how we might want to put norms in place, rather than just what some congressperson said without specific knowledge of the parties in controversy in 1978. So here's the claim. If law is better than legislation for crypto, then what follows? Well, first, we should actually reject calls to rationalize crypto policy through wholesale reform and legislation. We hear this all the time. We hear people make common complaints that Bitcoin is unregulated. We need to create a new regulatory structure for Bitcoin. Well, that's simply not true. Actually, a lot of the stuff that people do using Bitcoin is regulated, like money transmission licensing and anti-money laundering controls and all the things you have to do if you're an exchange like Coinbase. There's already legal regimes that were flexible enough that they fit new businesses. We didn't need to have a smart person in policy, like in Treasury or in the government, come up with a brand new regime. And if we did have someone, would they come up with a good regime? Probably not, because they just don't have the knowledge. It's an epistemological problem. It's not a problem of like will. Crypto is classified as a commodity, a security, property, and currency. Good policy would pick one. This is something you see a lot. You say like, well, wait, why can it be all of these things? And the fact is, actually, it's all of these things because we have a bunch of flexible regimes that regulate different things at different times for different purposes. So yeah, sometimes a cryptocurrency might be a commodity and sometimes it might be a security. And it's like local facts that should determine that, rather than just coming up with an arbitrary black line and putting it into the law because somebody's smart and has power in Congress. Old rules shouldn't apply to new tech. That depends. If we're doing the same stuff with new tech that we did with old tech, then old rules probably are better. And maybe that's the best way to find a future that's amenable to all of us, rather than start from scratch, which is dangerous. One agency should have plenary jurisdiction. Like we should have a US Department of Cryptocurrency or a European Union agency of crypto. Like, I don't want that. Who would run that? Do we trust them? Would it be one of us? Would it be someone who hates our stuff? Like, no, apply the existing structures. Now, there are problems with applying old law and flexible judge-made law to crypto. So I'll just be honest about where maybe I'm wrong. It's a slow process, and it is really a slow process. Like, we still haven't had a big securities law case about cryptocurrencies, whether there's commodities or securities in the US, go all the way to a court. We've had a few that have made it to court. We certainly haven't had one that's gone all the way up to, say, the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, who would ultimately be kind of the right judges to look at the local facts and to make a new ruling about how things have changed or not changed in this space based on the intimate knowledge of the parties involved, the issuer of the token and the buyers of the token. It takes time. It takes time to find the law, and there's a lot of potential for unexpected coercion in the meantime. So people criticize the SEC for being activists, going out there and forcing people to settle, saying you violated the laws. And that's because a lot of people don't want to go through the slow process. They just say, okay, I'll settle with the SEC. I'll admit that it was a security and pay a fine. And that's actually not good for the law, because then it never goes before a judge who finds the expectations of the parties involved and creates a new standard. It just ends up being settled, which isn't binding on future parties and doesn't create new knowledge in the sort of Hayekian sense. This is what I'm saying. Settlements, also administrative guidance. A lot of the rules now are being set by like a letter issued by the SEC. The DAO report was not a lawsuit against the creators of the DAO, which would have been sad because some of the creators of the DAO are really cool people, actually. But it was this report And it was like, this is what we think securities law means in the context of the DAO. But that's actually not authoritative. That's just their opinion. And it should have gone to a judge. And eventually we'll have another case kind of like that case where it will go to a judge. But the administrative guidance and the settlements aren't helpful in this sort of Hayekian sense. They're retroactive too, because we never had a holding on this. And now you're saying that I already need to settle with you. We're not actually reasoning about general rules of just conduct. We're just reasoning about statutory interpretation. So this is another criticism of my account of securities law. Securities law is a creature of statute. At one point, wise people in Congress created the Securities Act. And so this is kind of an example of top-down law. The smart people in the room said, this is how we should regulate investments. It's not totally bottom-up. But again, the wise people in the room in the 1930s were at least wise enough to create a flexible standard for what is a security, which is why we have that still judge-made rule, even when it's interpreting, legislator-made legislation. So maybe it's okay. And maybe it's okay if we also have general principles of things like constitutional rights in the US, where even if statutory law tried to do something, we can have a judge reason about the privacy and speech implications in a flexible judge-made way and check the legislature. And this is why, as much as I love a lot of my European companions in the regulatory space, I would not want to work in Europe because they don't have as much of a robust tradition of constitutional legal scholarship. Oftentimes, the things that the legislature does are considered primary and unassailable. There's certain protections for basic rights or for human rights, but there is not the tradition of the sort of activist Supreme Court here in the US saying, Congress, you did it wrong. This whole thing is gone. It can't be law anymore. Now, maybe I'm being unfair to my European friends, but this is something that I prize about the American jurisprudence is with really strong free speech protections that are all judge-made, case by case, local knowledge, parties in controversy, and some privacy protections in the form of a warrant requirement for government searches, the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. And then the last problem is so while we've been doing okay, I think, with the emergent law, we're kind of just waiting for Congress to wake up and start legislating things. And actually the infrastructure bill, which happened after I made this slide originally for the first time I presented this, is really indicative of how things might not be going well, because it might be that in a few years, we will have a Department of Cryptocurrency created by a statute that writes all about cryptocurrency regulation by people who don't actually know what cryptocurrency is, not on a fundamental level. And that will be bad. Are we? Will it? Questions. And there's also this sneaky continued expansion of administrative law into the private sphere. So there's a lot of private law out there. And we usually say that private law should dominate. If you don't like the way the DAO worked, maybe you sue the other people in the DAO under contract law. But we have this new tendency to extend public places and administration, which is usually like Hayek had this idea of administrative law as this, it started out as just the way we determine the salaries of people within the government bureau. But then it crept into the public place that is actually the private place. Now, all that administrative bureaucratic stuff is actually going to apply to individual persons. And it's going to apply to individual persons because we're not regulating the individual persons. We're regulating the business that they use, which is a government type business or a public place type business like a bank. And so whereas you have a lot of rights with respect to you and just another person that you're dealing with in private, you suddenly lose all your rights if you're dealing through a bank, because a bank is considered this sort of heavily regulated, government chartered, quasi-public private institution. And so we lose a lot of our constitutional rights that way. So for example, if I was to pay somebody at this conference in cash or in cryptocurrency, direct person to person, that's a private transaction. And government could suspect me of committing a crime by paying one of you, and they could get a warrant from a judge, and the judge would either say, yes, your suspicions are sufficient that will give you the ability to search Peter's transaction records, or no, we think you're harassing Peter because you don't like his political views. And that's a good check in our Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. However, if I pay any of you on Venmo, all those records are held by a public place, Venmo, which suddenly I have no private rights to. I have no privacy protections. They can just go to Venmo and say, hey, give me Peter's records. And Venmo will be like, here, and a judge is never involved. Reasonable suspicion is never involved. A warrant is never involved. So this is really dangerous. So I think I'm going to stop there because I do want to leave some time for questions. If we don't have any, I could talk a little bit longer, but I think I've gone pretty long already.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any questions? You can put them on the chat window or the Q&A. I don't see any questions at this point.
We'll let them trickle in.
One question from
from
Tim, by the way. Can you read the question yourself, or do you prefer me to read it for you?
Yeah. So Tim says, super interesting. Curious, what are Coin Center's top priorities for the next 6 to 12 months? So tax, as much as I hate working on tax, as you can see from my somewhat pejorative description of the way tax law works, tax is terrible in our space. It's the code has a lot of arbitrary logic in it, and now we have to apply it to a lot of very unique circumstances. So the big issues in tax law that I'd point out, there's the infrastructure bill stuff, which is who is a broker in this space. There's another part of the infrastructure bill that would apply coin and currency self-reporting regimes to crypto. So in the US, if you pay someone, or someone pays you more than $10,000 in cash and you receive it because maybe you sold them a used car, you're technically obligated to collect that person's social security number, their date of birth, their home address, and their name. And you, as the person who just got paid by them, have to send a report to the government saying, hey, this guy just paid me more than $10,000 in cash. Kind of sketch, right? Maybe you should check out their tax history. So that is already the law with respect to cash. And the infrastructure bill wants to make that the law with respect to cryptocurrencies, which is going to be a huge problem. Because if, for example, I'm a Bitcoin miner and I get a block reward that's more than $10,000, which it's going to be, who did I get that money from? Who do I report? Whose social security number do I put down? And beyond the ill-fittingness of that with cryptocurrency in mind, because of things like block rewards, it's just bad for privacy. Like, why should the government would need a warrant to search my cash receipts if they were just coming into my home to search them? Why can they force the person I'm paying to report on my cash receipts? Why is that suddenly okay under the Constitution? Anyway, that's one example. So there's the infrastructure tax stuff. There's we've wanted a de minimis cutoff for capital gains for a long time. If people are going to use cryptocurrencies as sort of transactions instead of just investments, then you're not going to want to have to calculate capital gains every time you make a small transaction that may have had a small gain from the time you bought the cryptocurrency, the time you used it to write a smart contract and to fund a smart contract. In fact, even like block fees, transaction fees, in theory, trigger a capital gains moment in the US tax reporting scheme. So we need to carve out transactions that have a gain smaller than $300. There's a proposal in Congress to do that. It needs to gain traction, but we're working on that. Another one is, how do we tax block rewards? Block rewards right now are taxed as you receive them, which for Bitcoin is kind of difficult, because maybe you get a block reward every few days or weeks if you're competitive, or a few months if you're not competitive. But for staking networks, you might get a block reward all the time. Like, you might have multiple ones during a day, small rewards. And if each one of those is a taxable event, it doesn't make sense. And we should think of block rewards as a reward for the work you've done on your own property. This is what I think. When a farmer grows corn, he doesn't get a letter from the IRS every time a new ear of corn grows on a stalk in his field. That would be insane. He gets taxed when he takes the corn to market and he sells it. So we should think of block rewards that way, and only tax them when they are sold at market, not when they are earned by the miner or validator. So the tax stuff is honestly our top priority. Another big area, I'll just say real briefly, is anti-money laundering. We saw last winter, FinCEN tried to create a more aggressive reporting regime that we thought was unfair for cryptocurrency exchanges. We called it the midnight rule, because it was at the end of the last administration, midnight. And we saw FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, try and push a much broader interpretation of VASP in their draft guidance last spring. All of that's going to come back again in the fall and the winter. And so we'll need to fight encroachments against our civil liberties in crypto transactions. That'll keep going.
So I see one more question in the chat and one in the Q&A. I kind of feel that you have kind of answered the question in the chat by giving the examples of stuff that you're currently working on. But the Q&A question is interesting. Again, if you want me to read it, I'm happy to. If you want
yeah,
to read it,
from Itai.
Now the one actually in Q&A from Dionysus.
Oh, where's
you can start with either.
Is the Q&A a different?
There's like a Q&A button, or I can read that.
I see it. So, I got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
I'll read it. So, as a European, isn't it a benefit of legislative law that we can know precisely whether what we do is legal or not? In common law, it's as if a law is applied through an ex post facto interpretation, regulating things that, yes. So, Dionysus, you would love Jeremy Bentham's critique of the common law. And I know I made fun of Jeremy Bentham for mummifying himself. But he was a very smart man, and we should take his critiques of the common law with heart. I think the hardest problem, too, is if we had small communities and good judges, this wouldn't be less of a problem, because the judge would always be able to be flexible in their interpretation and understand the technologies involved and understand the interests of the parties involved. Unfortunately, we have judges that don't understand this stuff at all and are just going to maybe in a rote way apply existing standards in a way that doesn't make sense. So a lot of it comes down to how smart is the person applying the law. And I guess my only point is, what's worse, when the not sensitive person is creating a standard that is inflexible and can never be changed except through new legislation, which takes years? Or is it less bad if the not sensitive person is a judge applying the standard in one case, whereas in another case, a judge can make a different ruling or be more sensitive to the parties and the circumstances involved? And that's what I like about the emergent common law is, yes, there will be these surprises where I didn't realize that, what I was selling is equivalent to a golf course membership before the golf course is built. But case after case after case with sensitive judges, we do less harm maybe than one standard, which actually is horrific and everyone has to be living under it rather than it being case by case. But that's a very unsatisfying answer. But this is the central question.
So I was also wondering, Peter, whether you could give us a quick overview of where things stand in terms with private cryptocurrencies. And by private, I mean like, Zika style CLD transactions. And is there anything you can comment on that?
So for these cryptocurrencies, which I'm obviously very passionate about, I did join the board of the Zcash Foundation because it was a nonprofit dedicated to adding privacy to cryptocurrencies. I don't just like Zcash though. I like the Monero effort. I like the idea of using ZK rollups and other things on non-private chains to add privacy. I think it's very important. From a money laundering policy standpoint, I think regulators are going to fear these things. They're going to say, well, we were okay before because we could do blockchain analysis to fill the gaps that we were getting in suspicious activity reporting and other, surveillance tools. And that's the moment where we're going to have to stand up and be brave as a community and as civil liberty advocates and say, well, maybe those gaps aren't going to be filled. Maybe you actually had too much power from a surveillance standpoint. And maybe, and this will have to happen in every country as it happens naturally in that country. But I know one thing I would want to do in the US is stand up and say, look, we have the tradition in this country of having judicial checks on surveillance. You can't just hoover up information. Yeah, we've gone astray. Look at the NSA. Look at the PRISM program that Snowden revealed to the world. This secret regime that is patently unconstitutional and goes against everything that we hold dear from our founding as far as personal privacy. So that's the fight we're going to have to fight with respect to privacy enhanced cryptocurrencies. And I would say that's a fight that is just as interesting to a Bitcoin or Ethereum person as it is to a Zcash person, because all of these cryptocurrencies are ultimately going to have some greater level of privacy. We can't go around having our full transaction history in plain text for all the world to see.
Thank you, Peter. I see the last question in the chat box, so maybe we can take that one and then conclude.
Sure. Is it within the scope of this talk to ask about money freezing court orders and how to deal with time locks, transactions that do or expire at a certain time in general? Interesting. I guess the question is sort of like, could we have courts use time locks in order to freeze money? I suppose we could. It's a technology. I think the harder problem is like, what if it's a civil asset forfeiture case where we don't want to freeze the money, we want to take it, but it's in a time lock, and it's the blockchain that enforces that time lock against the civil asset authorities. You know, at the end of the day, I think we should be cautious of making too much of this notion that we need to meld technology and law. Law is this messy, flexible discipline that is not deterministic like math or cryptography. And we should always have a human barrier in between. I'm not like a smart contract maximalist who thinks we'll be able to automate all human interaction and do it using blockchains. So to me, if a court wants to enforce a freeze order, they should just threaten the person with jail if they violate it rather than rely on a blockchain to enforce their will. Because I don't like violence either, but that's how the courts work, and we have to accept that. They work through soft power backed up by hard power, as in threats of violence. They don't work through some deterministic mathematical process. And making them work through some deterministic mathematical process might actually be worse for things like civil liberties and freedom than still having a human in the loop, like a judge and a court order that is, you know, just more traditional. But it's a great question.
All right, please join me in thanking Peter for this excellent talk.